Dear friends and colleagues from all over Europe, a warm welcome from the European Movement International Office here in Brussels, where we have gathered an excellent panel to discuss the Conference of the Future of Europe and see what's next. As a lot of you know, a couple of years ago, the European Union started a deliberative, inclusive process entitled the Conference of the Future of Europe to engage stakeholders, citizens, politicians, European institutions in an open debate around the direction that our union should take. The conference worked for about 12 months. It was comprised of European and national citizens panels that deliberated on a variety of issues and put forward recommendations, which were then debated, discussed, and eventually adopted in working groups and a plenary that brought together all the stakeholders that I mentioned afterwards. But of course, as ever, the discussions are going to count to nothing if they don't become action. And there is a lot of energy and activity at the moment to ensure that. And in this context, and building upon the work we have all done during the conference, we have gathered together representatives of the various components that were involved in the conference to have an event. And we're very lucky to have with us one of the citizens' representatives, Joy Clara Selfin, who was also working in the working group on values. Nice to have you with us, Joy. It's a pleasure indeed. We also have Senator Alice Mary Higgins from Ireland. She was representing the component of national parliaments and also worked with us a lot on the issue of values and democracy at large. We also have Dominic Ruiz Tevesa, a member of the European Parliament, representing then one of the institutions who worked on democracy, among other things. Dominic, good to have you with us. And of course, we also have Valeria Ronziti, the Secretary General of SGI Europe, one of the biggest employer organizations in Europe, which was also a member of the plenary representing the social partners. And last, but certainly not least, Marco Silento, who is head of institutional policy for the European Trade Union Confederation, one of the biggest components and also a social partner together with the employers who participated quite closely, the trade unions, and worked with us on the conference. Right. Thank you all for joining. Perhaps I can start with you, Joy. And it would be interesting to hear what were your impressions of that, in many ways, revolutionary, groundbreaking initiative that the EU undertook. And what were your impressions about the results of the conference? So both the process itself, but also the results.
Okay, nice to see you all. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this whole conference. Once again, I found it to be a very inspiring process for normal citizens like me, because we had the chance to really get an insight into the work of the Parliament. And during the process, I felt more and more like the people were really talking to each other eye to eye, and we were able to develop very great proposals. Of course, this whole process had a lot of difficulties because it was the first time that this was ever done, and but the organization team were very great, and they were adopting when something got difficult. And I'm like I said, I'm very content with our final proposals, and now I'm just hoping for them to be implemented and to be put into action. And I think that's at the moment what is being done right now. And so it's a very difficult and very difficult times. But we are hoping for the best, and we are hoping that we are taken seriously, and our proposals as well. And I think we are going to hear a lot about that in the nearer future.
Indeed. And this is perhaps the first time that the European Union introduced a deliberative element into its decision-making. The first time that the citizens' panels were constructed and applied both at the European but also at the national level. What was the sense you got from other citizens that were randomly selected and thrown into this process? Some of them were not even familiar with the European Union. Some were even not particularly fond of the European Union. So what was the sense in those 12 months of working with other citizens? How do you think others felt about the experience?
I think others felt like that as well. I mean, there were some people who were very critical of the European Union, kind of Eurosceptics, but of course, a lot of people were pro-European because we were invited to participate in a conference, The Future of Europe. And I think if you're not interested in Europe as a concept, you're not very likely to participate. But I think we were learning to work better together during the process, and I think we are all in all quite content with the outcome. But yeah, I think the different opinions, there were different opinions on, I think, nearly every topic. We had to discuss a lot of things. But I think all in all, this really brought together the real the spectrum of opinions in the European Union, because there are different opinions, and so it was, in my opinion, was very representative. So it was enriching for the debate, and we were able to really reach a consensus on the final proposals. So it was really enriching.
That's very good to hear indeed. And that's also the sense we got from working with the citizens. Maybe I'll move quickly over to you, Dominic. The European Parliament was very much at the core of this process. It hosted the plenary sessions of the conference, and it has also taken quite a lot of initiative for the follow-up on the conference. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about both the impression that parliamentarians, you are the representatives in many ways of citizens, your impression of working with citizens as your co-decision makers in a way, but also the work that the Parliament is now undertaking to ensure that these recommendations become a reality.
Thank you very much, Petros, first of all, for the invitation to be part of this meeting, which is very timely. And I agree with the previous colleague that the innovation of having citizens panels was a very good one. Of course, as every new experience, some situations were a bit unexpected and we had to manage them along the way. But on the whole, I think it worked well. And I think from the perspective of pro-Europeans, like we are, European Movement International, it was very useful because by and large, which is also understandable because it's in the end the mainstream view in I will say, European society, even if we go back to the results of the 2019 elections, that by and large the proposals that came from the citizens panels were in favor of more Europe. That means asking Europe to intervene in more fields of activity, particularly of transnational nature, like health, like climate change, like digital, which is normal. But also in fields like education, there was a big push for having European citizenship education available in all member states, which it's something that probably 10 years ago or even less was not in the agenda by any means. And also citizens asked for better Europe. Better Europe understood as more democratic and more efficient in how we make decisions. So a bigger role for the European Parliament, a bigger role for citizens themselves, also calls for having permanent systems of citizenship participation, similar to the one that we used during the conference. Also, the overcoming of unanimity, which is important both for efficiency purposes and for democratic purposes. So, by and large, the citizens panels were allies of the pro-European civil society like EMI, allies of the pro-European MEPs and national parliamentarians, allies of the Committee of the Regions, of the Economic and Social Committee. So I think this was a very positive coalition, I will say. And the overall conclusion of the exercise is that we need to do a number of things in this direction of more and better Europe in the context of the Lisbon Treaty, but also for the ideas that cannot be developed under the current framework, we need to adopt a new treaty that has to be stronger and more federal than the current one. And this is why the Parliament, and here with that I answered the second question, the Parliament was very much willing to already after the last plenary of the conference to come up with a resolution, the 3rd of May, asking for a convention, which we have reiterated also for legal reasons in the last plenary, but it's the same idea that we need to have a convention to look at a new treaty. And I think this is in line with the expectations of the conference. I think we are, in a way, fulfilling a commitment that the Parliament also took by saying in a resolution before the conference that we will commit to implement to do what we can do to implement the outcome of the conference. And this is why we have, I'll say almost in record time, triggered Article 48 of the treaty, which is the one that can take us to this convention and to this new treaty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I may follow up on that, because indeed, like Joy also said, there is clearly a lot of activity going on around it, but there is a concern that this activity is kind of removed away from our participation, so to say. You know, the parliamentarians, the member states in the council are the ones now trying to decide, the European Commission, of course, trying to decide how to implement this. If we do indeed go for a convention, what kind of a convention do you think this should be? An old-style one with just representatives of the institutions, or a more inclusive and open one, kind of mirroring a little bit the conference itself?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think we have to think of, I will say, a not overcomplicated format of the convention, because if we really value the work of the conference, we cannot really organize a convention that starts from scratch, right? Rediscussing everything like the conference never happened. If we take the conference seriously in the way it developed, and we take the conclusions of the conference seriously, the convention has to be very targeted to see how many of these ideas we have sufficient consensus or support to put into the new treaty. So I think it has to be a rather streamlined convention with, in my view, 2 working groups. We don't need, again, 10 working groups. 1 working group to deal with policies and 1 working group to deal with institutions. On the other hand, I agree with you that it cannot be a traditional convention that is purely institutional. So we need to have, again, the representatives of the organized civil society and the representatives of the citizens panel somehow. That's probably also to be thought out a little bit, because some say, and I think they have a point, that we cannot make these members of the panels like professionals, right, of this kind of exercise. So we have to see if we take again the ambassadors or some of the ambassadors, but we allow some other members of the panels to participate. But I think it's important that the organized civil society and some representatives of the citizens panels are involved, because you could be also very useful to act as the ones that defend the conclusions of the conference, right? So you can play a very important role in the negotiation of this convention to make sure that the politicians, I include myself there, don't cut backroom deals that don't respect the priorities of the conclusions of the conference. So I think it's very important to have you back in this capacity in a future convention. And last idea on the format, I don't think it should be too long either, because the important work has already been done with the citizens and with the organized civil society in the conference, and we should not disrespect that. So now our work is to make a test of political support and basically see what's the right formulation, legally speaking, if you will, as per the inclusion in the treaties. But I think we have to be focused, targeted, but with full participation of all the others, all the other non-institutional actors of the conference.
Perfect. No, I'm glad to hear that. And indeed, you also, as an MEP, were a great and strong advocate, both at the beginning of the process, when we were trying to get the social partners, civil society involved, but also throughout the process. And I think that has been very appreciated by everyone taking part in the conference. Maybe, Senator Higgins, if I can go to you, Mary, I know, it's interesting to also see the conference from the vantage point of the national level, because us here in Brussels and at the EU bubble, so to say, we were, of course, very much aware of it, but that didn't necessarily cut through at the national level as much as it should, as much as we would like to. And again, Ireland might be an exemption in that case, both because your government was very much invested in the process, also because of the European movement in Ireland, did a lot of work to raise the profile, but also because the Irish have an experience of participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and citizens' panels in particular. So it will be interesting to see how this was viewed from the national level, also how the discussions with other representatives of national parliaments took place during those 12 months. And perhaps whether you think that this experiment can become a permanent feature of European decision-making.
Okay, so for me, it was a really interesting experience, and my own background had been in civil society for about 15 years, including at European level before I became a national parliamentarian. So I just want to echo that point of organized civil society. Some of the issues that came through from this process are ones that organized civil society was maybe already shouting about. But what was really important and really interesting was, for me as a national parliamentarian, is to see that how many of the debates, the concerns that are happening at national level are happening at national level in other countries, and how powerful it was when citizens were able to say, these are our concerns about childcare, these are our concerns about the environment, and it was almost a great opposite of the divide and conquer frame, where instead it was being recognized as common patterns of concern and common demands. So I think it was really good in that way. I think looking at the evolution of the process, at the very beginning, there was quite a lot of very hard stall setting, especially from national parliamentarians around particular views and positions. And what I really saw is that over the course of the process, and particularly in the working groups, we began to have kind of light replacing heat in some of the discussions. And I know for me, I was on the values group working with Joy and with other citizens. And I think there was a really useful exchange there between parliamentarians and citizens, whereby citizens were highlighting concerns, and we were able to kind of maybe flag in some cases, national, but in many cases, in more cases, European level instruments that could be used to deliver the kind of policy concerns and priorities citizens that were coming through with, and where the instruments were not there to identify almost those bigger changes that are needed in our systems, in our frameworks, to deliver that. And I think that was a really useful exchange and a really useful discussion, and I thought that evolved really well. I thought, I mean, I'm sure everybody was on different groups and thought they were great. I thought Values and Rights was a brilliant group in that regard. And what was really interesting for me as well, and I think it came through and it fits with what I know from on the ground in Ireland about how people feel about Europe, is it's not just around, the strength of Europe or what Europe does. It's about what it is to be in Europe, what it is to live in Europe, and that the values piece, in terms of not just a Europe that's strong, but a Europe that's good. So the values of Europe came through. And what was really interesting, I saw there were 2 or 3 areas, and I think this is something we have to be kind of honest about. Some areas got a lot of a strong, there's this huge long list of recommendations. Some of them were incredibly strongly supported. And in fact, similar recommendations came through from multiple working groups with different citizens on them. And then there are others that were more controversial, and which I feel near the end, in the kind of the push towards the end, towards conclusion, people just didn't want to stand in the way of. So just, for example, the question of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that being on a legal basis. So the idea that and that does potentially require treaty change, but that every person in Europe would have their fundamental rights, and that when we vindicate rule of law, and there was a really strong demand from citizens, they want rule of law enforced, that the Charter of Fundamental Rights part of that came through in 2 or 3 different panels. The idea of ethical supply chains, of spending European and national money in ethical ways, that came through in lots of different panels as well. The part that, and maybe we'll have a chance to discuss it more, but that I found frustrating, I'll be honest, and I was frank about this in the process, was the EU in the world process. And in the very final sessions of the national parliamentarians meetings, it was actually one of the ones where many national parliamentarians were a little bit frustrated around the EU in the world and had looked for that to be reflected, but I don't think it was really at the end. And that's one area where the way I would put it is, what made it really clear and what was really strong is the process showed us and reminded us that we are living together in Europe, and that came up with really incredible recommendations that are strong, that are practical, about how we can live together better in Europe. In terms of how Europe relates to the rest of the world, I think the conversation maybe fell a little bit short, and I think maybe there's further and maybe difficult conversations to be had about that.
Indeed. And, in many ways, we forget that this was the first time something like this was attempted, and maybe the conference runs the risk of becoming a victim of its own success, because there were indeed areas where we could do better, and we shouldn't neglect that. Valeria, from the perspective of social partners, particularly employers, and especially the type of employers you represent, those who provide social services and services of special interest, do you think that the quality of the content, the proposals that came forward, were they general or quite particular? I mean, especially on healthcare, with the pandemic in the background, we saw some very interesting recommendations. So both in terms of the content, but then also in terms of the process, perhaps building on what other speakers have said. How do you view what took place, and how can we make this better going forward?
Yes, thank you, Petros. And you rightly precise that as an employer, we represent a specific part of the employers for the one of employers providing service of general interest. And that's maybe why I felt very much at ease in an exercise together with the citizens. Because for us, it was really a kind of reality check about whether the service we deliver on a daily basis to citizens are going to the right direction, and whether Europe is doing enough to help those services to fulfill their mission. And of course, one of the striking examples is the one of healthcare. I followed specifically the group on healthcare, and my president followed the one on climate change. Also there was a lot going into our direction. But I would say if we take this issue in terms of the process, I would like to have the citizens together with me in any meeting I am attending, because they were the best promoter and defenders of a strong service of general interest. And this was going through all the spectrum. There were some quite generic, so to say, issues like, but generic, but more important, very important for us, like better funding, a very strong discussion, really pushing back any attempt to change the wording about the fact that public funding should go to non-profit and public healthcare. So very strong. The fact that there was the request for more competence of Europe on healthcare, and this was clearly a discussion that was a consequence of observing what happened during the pandemic. I don't think that we should have had this conference only 4 years ago. Maybe citizens would have not been so vocal about that, because, you know, the principle of subsidiarity, the local power about healthcare was, and in some cases still is, very strong. So the pandemic had an impact on the ambitions of this group. But then there were also very, very concrete proposals, and I was sometimes surprised by the sharpness of the citizens that didn't necessarily come with a technical background to the discussion, but they were very clear about what they wanted to see. And here I refer, for instance, to mental health. That became a very big topic in the working group, more than the EU institution were expecting. You know, also this kind of narrative, very often we heard it about the European Commission. Yeah, but we are already doing this. Then the answer to this from the citizens was, yeah, but then if you are already doing it, just do it better or do it more, because we don't see the effect. And another very specific discussion we had was on the Nutri-Score system and how to evaluate how healthy a food is. Also, this was a very technical discussion, and the citizens were absolutely able to point the finger at what was not going well at the moment, despite not having the technical background. So to me, this was really an enriching experience, and I very much like the proposal that came in one of the last plenaries, that this should become a kind of regular exercise, a midterm review, at least for the Parliament, to have an exchange with citizens and see whether the European Parliament is going to the right direction and fulfilling the mandate for which they have been elected.
Yeah, and I think that's something we need to also tackle, perhaps. But first, I'll come to you, Marco, because just like Valeria mentioned, we saw a very strong desire from the citizens' constituency for a more social, a more sustainable, a more fair kind of society. Something we have also seen reflected in our work as a civil society organization. We have seen through polling we have commissioned. There is an appetite for a different kind of Europe, just to coin a phrase. And obviously the trade unions have leading in that regard for a while. In the work that the ETUC, the trade union movement, did in the context of the conference, did you also get a similar impression about the desires that the citizens have about not just Europe, but the economy and society at large?
Thank you for this question, Petros. Actually, as a trade union movement, having as at our heart the interest of workers, I have to say we have been positively surprised by the quality of the inputs that citizens brought into the conference, especially this attention to social and environmental issues. I have to say that clearly we can interpret or we can understand these messages arriving from the citizens as a need to move from the neoliberal austerity concept of the economy to the era of sustainability. The sustainability era is probably the right way to conceive the moment we are entering to, and also the way to give an answer to the good inputs arriving from the citizens. So it means our people, our Earth, our planet Earth at the center, our democracies. This is absolutely the message arriving during the conference, and this is really something that we can support. Of course, this request, these policies that the citizens want to activate are proposal for our society, not only for the EU. The EU is there and has to do its own part, but the EU is a part of the solution. This is clear because they were designing the society they want. And the society they want, which is fairer, which is respectful of the environment, that is respecting the rule of law, as someone said, or is giving opportunity and justice to people, is the ambition of all the institution levels we have in our governance, in our way to build our common institutions. So the EU is part of the solution, and they have to do its own part. So I have to say that the direction where we have to go is very clear. I was very surprised of the quality of the inputs concerning fighting poverty, the reference to a minimum income. We had proposals that were covering several phases of the life of people. And I understand that people believe, and many of the citizens present there, they confirm that people really believe that the solution is often in the EU, or a good part of the solution is in the EU, but they have a little trust in the fact that the politicians can deliver. The capacity of the politicians to use the European institutions to create more solidarity, to implement the right policies is not always there. So what the task we have is really also as a trade union, because as social partners, we are policymakers, we can have our own part of responsibilities, is to show that it's possible to cooperate within the EU and to deliver, to give results, to make tangible result for people, and it's possible to open a constructive dialogue. I take an example, the debate on migration was not always easy. And frankly speaking, I have to say that the way citizens were addressing the problem was a lesson for us, because even when they did not agree with my ideas, for instance, I always found the space, the ground for dialogue, and possibly to achieve a compromise or to meet halfway. This is a way to address problem. That is the correct one, and probably this is a lesson we have to learn. Coming to my final point, to the social dimension of the EU that was so important to citizens, I have to say that there are certain things that can be done with the instruments we have. For instance, if citizens were claiming for giving more opportunities to women in the labor market to participate in our society, to give children the possibility to receive care from the very moment they start their life, or if they want to have more opportunities for young workers, especially exercising free movement, well, we have a policy program that is ready, to create concrete policies and solutions, which is the European Pillar of Social Rights. And we have a method, we have the social dialogue. We are social partners, so it's I know what we are talking about. It's true, we don't represent the entire society, but if you have the governments, and if you have the production, the companies, and you have the workers that agree on something to be done, okay, you already have done a lot. I mean, you have already solved great part of the problems. So social dialogue is crucial, is key. Some other things must go through treaty change. We have to be clearly, we have to say it very clearly, If we really want to go in the direction that citizens were showing to us, we must be brave enough to reopen the treaties without ideological positions, but with the idea to create a Europe for people. And here some others people in this panel have already touched upon this topic, so I will not enter in it unless you have a specific question, Petrus.
No. Thank you very much, Marco. No, this is quite useful. Joy, if I may come back to you. Obviously, as you can gather from everyone who just spoke and represented different components of the participating in the conference, there was great appreciation for this innovation of having citizens panels And that was also part of your recommendations, wasn't it? Some of the proposals that came through spoke about making this kind of process more permanent, either for specific issues or for general discussions. How do you think, do you actually believe that we could or we should make deliberative and participatory democracy alongside representative democracy a permanent feature of the European Union decision-making process?
Of course, this conference was a huge thing, and lots of organization and stuff. So I'm understanding that it's not possible or realistic to make it very regularly, or I mean very often. But there were some ideas about making this kind of conference on the future of Europe, like every 5 or 10 years, or something like that. And I think that is a very good opportunity, because I think after this conference, a lot of us ambassadors and also members of the panels are very great advocates for the European Union. And I think if we can make this a regular thing, we can enable this reality check with the citizens, so that everyone can make sure that they are in touch with each other and in dialogue, which I think is very valuable. And the second thing is that this kind of process creates a more it helps with creating a more European identity, because we were talking about that a lot as well, that we need to feel connected within Europe, to be more to have more solidarity between the different countries and the different languages and cultures. And I think those are two very important points, which I would talk about in this topic. I think it would be very valuable, and it would be a great project, really.
I think that also is an important element, like making citizens ambassadors for the European project, because again, often our work here in Brussels, but also the capitals, is to really engage citizens and explain what are the benefits of having the European Union. But I think coming from you, it's perhaps even stronger. Dominic, I know that you might have to leave shortly, so I just wanted to come back to you perhaps before and also check, because the European Parliament, parliaments in general, national parliaments as well, are very much at the core of the democratic process. You know, directly elected representatives from citizens deliberating and coming up with solutions to the challenges we face. But do you think there is a complementarity here, together with this deliberative democracy, or there is a risk of perhaps competition between the two, if we were to make this more permanent, both every 4 or 5 years, a conference in general about the future of Europe, but also in particular issues that might affect, be it the environment, social issues, or others?
Well, thanks again, Petros, for the opportunity to touch upon this important subject. I think, in general terms, for me, clearly is a matter of complementarity more than competition. Of course, it also depends of the design. I think we need a good design for a permanent system. I think probably this design has to be, I don't know if narrower is the right word, but some things that happened in the conference probably cannot be repeated in a permanent system linked to the legislative process. What do I mean by that? In the conference, the working groups, well, there were differences among the working groups, but there was a strong empowerment of the citizens panels by conscious decision, by agreement. So, for instance, in the working group democracy, we agreed that all the proposals from the citizens panels have to be included in the paper of the working group. That was one important thing that was not mandatory by the rules of procedure. And second, that if we wanted other members of the working groups that did not belong to the panel, we wanted to add new things, that required that there was no opposition by the citizens panels, right? So this was a strong empowerment, which I don't think it was a bad idea for that setting. Now, because the setting of the conference is to make a proposal to the institutions about the future of Europe. Now, if we were to have a permanent system in which, for instance, and I think this is something that the European Parliament can do even by itself and without changing the treaty, so I'm making here a very concrete proposal, we could envision a system by which, for some legislative proposals that the Commission sends to the European Parliament, that the Parliament, to be very concrete, let's say the Conference of Presidents, or which by that I mean the meeting of the presidents of the political groups in the House, they consider to be very strategic legislative dossiers, they could have the power, or maybe even the committees competent for the file, they could have the power to convene a citizens panel built along the same lines of the ones that we had in the conference. That means randomly selected, representative of society, and so on, and to have an input from this panel into the legislative process. So an input that can influence the position of the Parliament in the negotiation with Council, meaning in informing the position of the Parliament on that file. Now, if we were going to do that, the only way that this will be acceptable in terms of how representative democracy works, and also for the political groups in the House that are not so enthusiastic about this novelty of deliberative democracy, it has to be very clear that the input is not mandatory, that there is no possibility for this panel to, veto items in the legislation or anything of that. It has to be very clear that this is an input that enlightens the work of the legislators. In such way, I think it will be, or it could be acceptable to all the political groups, and that it could work very well, and it could provide this complementarity. Let's bear in mind that the Commission already has public consultations when they are going to make legislative proposals. But there, which is a good thing, but it's only the main stakeholders, the ones that are following the topics that are well established in Brussels, maybe also the ones that have the resources to participate effectively in this public consultation. Here, what we will do is to use the input of the citizens panels for the benefit of the Parliament in informing its position, in the same way that we also call experts to the committee responsible to have the opinion of the experts. So we'll have also the opinion of randomly selected citizens. I think with this kind of design, it could be politically acceptable and that it could work very well.
Of course. Thank you. Joy, would you like to respond maybe to this kind of idea that Dominic put forward?
Yes, definitely. I think that is a very great idea, because we all citizens, we know that we are not elected officials and we don't really have real power or can vote on something. We just wanted to be part of the process, of course, and to be heard. And what you were proposing, I think also, if a convention on treaty change will happen, I think this concept would also be a very good thing to have during that process, because we have these proposals and all the politicians are discussing them, and I think if there will be work on the treaties, there should be citizens there to make sure that there's not just this cherry picking of some citations from us and just say, well, the citizens said that, but we really want to make sure that we got the key messages right, that we have the key ideas not being misinterpreted or something like that. So that would be, for the treaty change process, that would be very valuable, I think.
Indeed. I mean, from the national perspective, perhaps, Dominic is approaching it from the European level. Obviously, the European Parliament has a very big role to play in crafting a direction for the EU. How do you think, Alice Mary, how do you think the national parliaments could also feature in this new construction, perhaps?
Okay, so just on the citizens' assemblies, because I think Ireland did kind of lead around introducing these citizens' assemblies, and where we've found them to be most effective is where they are on specific topics, and in particular, adding kind of maybe light and modeling different difficult conversations on particular issues. So not simply, as a kind of a focus group, and it's really important that it doesn't get treated as some, but empowering citizens. So it's important if there are citizen assemblies that get brought in on particular issues, that it's not simply a kind of a narrow, constrained focus group style from, but that the citizens are empowered to say, actually, the framing on this issue is wrong, or the framing on this approach, or here's the thing that's not on the agenda that needs to be, and to kind of name that. And I think that's important. I know in Ireland, as I say, though I still think our single transferable vote is probably our best political innovation we can offer. But in terms of the citizens' assemblies, where they've been most impactful has been where you take conversations where we almost, the cliche is that it's too difficult to discuss. So in Ireland, we had one on abortion. We've had one on marriage equality. And in fact, what we found is people do engage respectfully and constructively. It was very much what was described there in terms of the migration debate. And again, within this Future of Europe process, the migration debate is one which could have been framed in a very, damaging and way, but in fact, citizens engaged because they made it person-centered and they engaged respectfully and constructively. And I think that's what these assemblies can do. I think there's two things. One is specific targeted ones on particular issues. That idea, I think, is a good proposal. But also, I think those who've been involved in this particular process with these particular recommendations, I do think it is important that would be checking back in with them. And I liked the idea of almost a reconvening of the plenary in 1 year's time or in 18 months' time to discuss kind of what has happened, where the recommendations have gone, and then just in practical and other levels with the Irish piece, staying in touch and connecting with those citizens who contributed from grassroots level in Ireland, who maybe put things up into the platform or the digital platform, or who held events, to continue the conversations with them. And what I have been trying to do as a national parliamentarian, I'm sure other national parliamentarians are trying to do, is, for example, in Ireland, we scrutinise EU legislation and we have been feeding back points. I've met 2 EU commissioners who have come to talk about our national policies to us here in Ireland and EU policies, and I've been able to feed back directly specific recommendations from the citizens and the Future of Europe process as feedback from me at national level to the EU Commission again. And really crucially, it's important, and I think all of the institutes need to be reminded of this, and this is why keeping that engagement is there, is that it's not simply these aren't just add-ons, that they need to be actual changes in business as usual. So, for example, when I met an EU commissioner who is developing, looking at budgetary processes, the real question is, one of our recommendations from Values and Rights is that they should change the semester process. And how is that getting translated in? So kind of putting those questions into the right places, I think, is something national parliamentarians can contribute to through, and I've seen more enthusiasm in the engagement with national parliamentary scrutiny of EU legislative proposals. So, for example, our climate committee has started sending political contributions to debates, which is a power national parliaments have but tend not to use. So I think there's using the powers we have and then strengthening them.
Indeed, Valeria, I mean, if you're of course welcome to comment on the idea of how perhaps you can institutionalize, for a lack of a better term, the participatory and deliberative element that the conference introduced. But also in terms of the content, do you think it will be better indeed if we invite citizens to deliberate on very specific issues, perhaps the things that you mentioned about services of general interest, or the things that Marco was saying with regards to fairness in our society at large, or perhaps have them there as a watchdog, checking that long-term proposals are indeed implemented?
It's not easy to shape the future of this process. The only thing I know is that we shouldn't lose and waste the capital we have achieved with the conference. Actually, this Friday, as maybe some of you know, or many of you know, the European Commission is going to publish a communication with some guidance on what to do next. So I'm also waiting to see what's their proposal, if it is ambitious enough or not. But I'm afraid that they will, in a way, put into the spectrum the fact that indeed there are already public consultation, and so any citizens has the possibility to answer and participate and influence EU policy making. However, as Dominic was saying, only a bunch of happy few is even aware that those public consultations are taking place. So it is for sure that we can't go back to normal. The conference must leave as a legacy a new methodology. But to be sure about what the methodology is already is not given for granted. One option could be that we leave the digital platform a permanent platform for idea, for getting feedback. This is one option. The other, the kind of permanent consultation when it comes to a certain topic, I'm a bit skeptical simply because I would fear that, again, is going to be a limited exercise, because unless you keep alive the system that Mission Publique found in order to select the citizens randomly, is not going to be an exercise that you can permanently put in place, and you will end up with always the same group of citizens being the kind of permanent / special advisors to the EU institution and even the social partners into the exercise. So I'm not sure this is going to be per se adding value. I, on the contrary, very much agree with Mary that those who participated this time have a right and a need to be absolutely informed from A to Z about all the follow-up, the idea they put forward, the 49 proposals, what the EU is going to do with them. So I would be more concentrated in making sure that the process is lived up until the end with the current proposal before starting creating a new process. My idea about the midterm review was mainly targeting the European Parliament, because I think that if we look at the plenary room, there were not so many MEPs participating each and every time. So yes, we had Dominic, all those who were really convinced about the process were there very frequently, but the majority of MEPs were absent. And this midterm review would also be able to target them, and I think it would be a very valuable exercise.
Indeed, that's true. And I think a lot has been also said, especially those who participate in the conference, about the fact that several members didn't show up as frequently as they should. And I know that's something that the citizens also pointed out. But from the perspective of civil society and the social partners, and I consider you part of that broader civil society, not least both because SGI and ETUC are members of the European Movement International Network. I think from our perspective, we really actively engaged in this process and in many ways, as it was already said, enriched it. Marco, do you think, again, you pointed out the fact that social partners are indeed members of policy making at the European level. Do you think that now we are debating introducing perhaps citizens panels in this? Should we institutionalize also the role of organized civil society in decision making, both in general but also in particular policy areas? The conference featured only 8 representatives of civil society, and I'd like to believe we played our part. Is there a way you think we can make civil society an equal partner in this discussion?
So even here, I would say it depends on many things. Of course, what we have learned in this conference that is important, that people like us stay in Brussels and working in policy making, we stay in a listen mode, and we can have ready to listen to the inputs that arrive from people that have less chances than us to leave the institutions and the policy and the places where the politics take place. So this being listen mode is quite an issue. I think we have to be part of the process. There is one element that I find particularly valuable in this exercise and the conference on the future of Europe that's convinced me that we have to continue this exercise probably every 2 years, not every year, because it's quite time consuming. This issue is that we were not asking citizens to say what they think about certain things, but is to converge on some ideas. So to select the ideas and to have limit the list of priorities that could satisfy everybody. So this is also for people that are not used to live the politics, let's say, to experience the exercise of the compromise, how difficult it is, but also how fantastic it is to get confronted with people that have different thinkings. To make this summary, to make this convergence, I think that the role of civil society is really crucial. Our experience proven the fact that we are able to stay in this famous listen mode I was referring earlier. So because otherwise the dialogue will not be there and we will not have the added value that on the contrary the conference showed to have. So probably it's not a full-fledged answers, but I think with these elements, I think it's important to build something in the future that could give a follow-up to this experience, to institutionalize and to have a regular impact. I'm sure that because of the success in the very end, because people were happy, in the future, more people will be interested in the conference on the future of Europe, and probably there will be a larger participation, and the third time it will be even bigger, and so on. I think it's worth it to continue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, and I sense that there is this consensus that emerged from everyone who took part and observed the conference, even though there were well-founded criticisms of the process. I think the result certainly justified the effort that went into it. If I may come back to something that we mentioned a little bit at the beginning, this idea of the convention and perhaps the necessity to amend the treaties, because it came quite strongly from the recommendations of the citizens, and I think it was echoed by the majority of those taking part, that the way the EU makes decisions isn't suitable for today's world, where our challenges are very big and they require often a quick response, a very resolute response. And I'm thinking in particular the question around the veto that member states have and the need to achieve unanimity to have decisions. Joy, in your discussions, and some of you were novices in EU decision-making processes, how prominent was that debate, and to what degree you think that this is one of the elements that you wouldn't like to see compromised or gone away, the reforming the decision-making to make it, to streamline it and make it more effective?
I think it was kind of a side product of all our discussions, because in the beginning we were having some difficulties with the process, and we were asking if we should, because we didn't have any knowledge of the European law as normal citizens and how everything is going to work. So we were asking if we should keep that in mind, what is possible within the treaties. And they told us that we shouldn't focus on that and just focus on the topics. So that was kind of a side process that we heard again and again, that some of those proposals are not possible without treaty change, because also there's this unanimity thing, which is always kind of an issue. So I think that is, like I said, it's just a thing that needs to be changed to even open the door for some of our proposals. So that was kind of a side product, I think, but perhaps somebody else has a different view on that.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Mary, from your perspective, from the national perspective, obviously the debate around unanimity also revolves or centers upon the need for small and big member states to have a say in the decisions taken by the EU. Do you think the issue of unanimity could be a problem for smaller member states? And perhaps what's your view with regards to the Irish government and the discussions that are going to be taking place in the days and weeks ahead?
Yeah, so, okay, first I should just say it's Alice Mary, but that's fine. Just because there is a Mary Higgins in politics as well, so that's why I have to distinguish. I think that what Joy describes there is that the policies, the proposals, those were the driving factors for the citizens, and then it is the question of, are there points at which the policies cannot be implemented because of a block, and that question is, and again for me, yes, I think there is space around the convention, around things like treaty change. I'll be honest, I'm more confident around things like treaty change and things like putting the Charter of Fundamental Rights on a legal basis, so it becomes part of the legal architecture of the EU, than on certain other points. And I think there is scope in terms of the issue of voting, but I worry that sometimes the idea of moving away from unanimity voting became the center stage instead of being about how do we deliver these policies, and if necessary, almost area by area, we think about, is unanimity voting a real block to progress on those areas, and the case being made, almost thematic by thematic in that regard. So in terms of on changes in rule of law, or on changes in things like core social policies, which were so key. And I'm raised that because I think it's really important, and it would be regrettable if it became that the discussion and the outcome of this became solely focused on the unanimity voting, which I do think it does need to be discussed, but it became that we end up moving further away from citizens, in terms of citizens in Ireland, citizens in, I don't know, Malta, in Croatia, wherever it might be, because there was unanimity voting. So citizens felt that they could not influence their government in terms of their government then influencing and having a really strong impact on EU decision making. So I think that's the balance that needs to be fought. I am open, and I think there is a case for looking at a convention, to look at treaty change, but I think a simplistic narrative around, for example, qualified majority voting in all cases. And I'll be clear again, in terms of on the foreign policy, and I know we'll get questions later. I've seen one coming in. I won't answer it yet. I think it's a really good question, but I think that's for me an area, given that Ireland is a neutral country, and I was really disappointed, for example, that just the simple question was the suggestion of there was respect for countries' membership of NATO was inserted, but there was a suggestion, I had suggested that we would insert respect for countries' neutrality being mentioned, and that wasn't there in the text. Didn't give me a sense of confidence that on that piece, and again, that's specific, but yet I think there are other core areas like rights, like social policies, crucially like environment, where the same challenges have been faced. The issues can only be tackled at a common level. They cross borders, and it's really important that progress on them is allowed. And again, if that comes up against an issue, but I think it should be driven, the discussions on this, by the policies and by identifying the blocks in each case rather than by a kind of a sweeping move to qualify majority voting in all cases across the board. That's my personal perspective.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. Valeria, we had discussions about this within the European movement, and you're leading one of our political committees who is very much focused in that. What's your view on what Alice Mary just said?
I very much understand her concern, and in the sense that there was indeed this risk that the conference would transform into, the agenda of some of the few and not of the many. We saw this at the very start of the conference when. Especially at the moment where we didn't have so many exchanges with the citizens. But at the end of the process, I think that we can confidently agree with Joy that at the end of unanimity is a request that results as a side effect of the conference. And I'm very honest, as a member of the European movement and chair of PC1, this was not for me to be a side effect. We had this as one of our requests and in our position of the MI papers and positions since many, many years. So we were not coming with a neutral agenda. It's clear that we wanted this. But I think that we have been very honestly and neutrally listening to the citizens, and the process was fairly managed. I didn't follow all the working group, but in my working group, for sure, the chair really left the lead, the citizens, and they have been simply guided to see where, in order to achieve the realization of the policy proposal they were making, an end of unanimity was necessary. So I must say that we achieved a very good result, that this is now on the paper, but not because of the agenda of few MEPs plus the Spinelli group, etc., but because of a general result. This being said, it would be a huge mistake, and I again agree with Alice Mary, to reduce the result of the conference and reduce the request of a convention on this point, because it would undermine the whole exercise. It's not only about that. From the governance of the EU, however, we all know that this is going to be a extremely powerful unblocking point to achieve EU result, EU policy result in the future. So from the Euro nerd, EU nerd that we are in the European Movement International, this remains a fundamental point. From the SGI point of view, from the SGI Europe point of view, my membership is not, is not a priority issue. The priority issue of my membership is that all the package of recommendation is put into place, is implemented, because there are so many more important issues for my membership, like investment in infrastructure, in public infrastructure, that they would be deceived if they only see a focus on end of unanimity.
Indeed, and obviously we shouldn't miss the forest for the bush. Marco, I mean, from the perspective of the trade unions, and again, you represent millions of workers around Europe, and you're very much about democracy at work as much as democracy in our society. Do you think that this process that we experimented with can contribute to strengthening our democracy, and whether the trickle-down effect can also translate in other forms where, again, the decision-making can be more collective on the floor of factories, for example, as well as on the floor of parliaments?
Okay, first of all, let me say something on this issue of unanimity. I think that having a majority vote, qualified votes, etc., is a necessity because it's an issue of efficiency of the decision-making processes. Probably if you will get more integrated and you want to achieve strategic autonomy, you have for an efficiency, general efficiency, to arrive there having a larger use of a qualified majority. The problem is that efficiency not necessarily means fairness and justice. So the moment you introduce the majority votes, you have to start taking care of the minorities. And if it happens that someone is permanently in minority position, probably you have to find a mechanism where the institution stops and asks why you are permanently in a minority position. Can we do it to bring back into the process in order to have full ownership of all the constituency in the decision making we do? I say this because in the past, if I take, let's say, the period between the start of the new century until 2015, the workers' movement, we represent 45 million workers, so it's not a little number of people. We have been systematically in minority, and we haven't been able to make our voice heard until there was a reopening of the dialogue with the social partners, and the institutions try to give back the voice to the workers and to the workers. So, and we suffered a lot the fact that nobody wanted to listen to us, even if we were fully convinced that the economic and social receipts that were used at the time were profoundly wrong, and the reality today showed that the austerity decision were wrong. But in that moment, we were permanently a minority and nobody wanted to hear to us. It was impossible to enter into the process. So once again, in my view, the majority, let's say democratic processes that can use a qualified majority and not the unanimity is question of efficiency, but we need something more to obtain fairness and justice. Of course, all this participation process should arrive on the workplace, because there is a part of the powers that regulate our society that come from the institution and the political game. That normally the power is exercised through voting and party, but there is a huge part of the power that influence our life that come from the ownership of capital, of equity. You have shares, you vote. You don't have the shares, you cannot vote. If you have big capitals, you can be influential. If you don't have, you will not have a voice. So the wider concept of democracy and fairness comes not only from those who let's say regulate the political powers, but also the market power. In this case, if we want to have a real fair and democratic society, we have to redistribute the power in all this domain. That is why economic democracy, democracy at workplace is so important, because it's an important complement of the relationship, the positive relationship between democracy and market economy. And this must be very clear to everybody. And what does it mean in practical terms? Introducing rules that promote collective bargaining, right to workers, workers' right at workplace, and rights of workers and their trade unions to be part of the processes, the governance of the companies, and possibly also to the capital and equities of the company. So these are all elements that improve the democratic quality of our society and institutions.
Very true indeed. And perhaps, Joy, I can come to you for, as we're nearing our close, what would you consider a success for, at least from the perspective of the citizens that took part in this process? What would you think that there is a success of the conference, and that you could really go take with you and share with your friends, your family, your peers at university?
I think a very good outcome of the a very good outcome of the conference would be if we can see a lot of implementation. And there I want to add a little thing, that because we were talking about this unanimity thing, and that it was like I said, it was kind of a side product, but we had we came to that point so many times that I think, in my opinion, as an ambassador, it now became a very big priority for us, because it limits us with the proposals that we made. And if we are staying within the borders that we have now, kind of closing the door and locking it, and disabling many of our proposals. That was the first thing. But that I wanted to add in at this point. And I think this outcome from this conference was that there is a European society that is very engaged in this whole process, and that is very enriching for all of us. And I think the outcome for me is that I'm just a huge advocate for the European project. And yes, I think that's all that I can say at the moment. Mostly I like to rethink all the things that were said and then add something, but this is kind of difficult in this format. So I think for now that's all that I would like to add.
And that in itself, I think, is very powerful, and also it's something that has been echoed from some of the comments that have been posted on social media, especially with regards to informing citizens. Educating them is the term that Anna from Poland used in her question, but I think it's more a question of informing rather than educating. And maybe, Alice, maybe we can since the question is first and foremost targeted towards you, but I think it's important to hear what others think too. How can the EU, how can we all, including the citizens ambassadors who took part, the social partners, civil society, politicians, do more to inform the world about what the European Union is and what it does, so then they can feel more included into this project that we call EU?
Okay, I think the question was maybe a little bit different than that, in a way that it wasn't simply around a kind of an information piece. It was around what are the assumptions that we maybe need to examine that the EU can be making. And I say this again, as I say, I'm so passionate about the EU and I love these ideas, but it comes back almost to those points that were being made in terms of, with austerity, civil society signaled it very strongly, the importance of the shift whereby there would be the redistribution of power around participation and around voice. And that is one of the reasons why, for example, I think it is different when you talk about changing voting systems internally on internal policies, because you can try to create balances that address minorities, that look to equality and fairness and justice. You can find other mechanisms of accountability and participation, because the decisions you're making, to ensure that everyone affected by the decisions you're making has the opportunity to influence those decisions through other mechanisms, if not through the current voting powers or veto, for example. So that's why you can, within that closed system, address that. But the thing is, internationally, the fact is that the EU, the point was made there that Europe assumes that everybody thinks of the European Union as a single thing, but many, many countries across the world have many and diverse relationships with different EU countries and different histories. So, for example, there is the decolonization project, which countries need to be looking at, and individual countries in Europe have different relationships with other countries in terms of the colonial legacy and the need to unwind that, in terms of different countries have different contributions. That's why I mentioned, for example, Ireland being neutral. It was, for example, Ireland was able to represent the EU in the Colombian peace talks and be quite effective, because we are a country that had the experience of colonization, was able to come with a particular relationship to those discussions. So I think there's different richnesses and different challenges in individual countries, which, while we move forward together, also need to be examined. And then I would say this is an example of the contradictions, the assumptions. I think a lot of the citizens assumed that the values that are so important to us in Europe that we all want strengthened, that those are the values Europe is promoting internationally. But for example, we discussed health equality, how important that was to the citizens, public health. And yet right now, the European Union, in an area where it has competency, so nobody's vetoing it or blocking it, it's a trade competency, is directly blocking equal access to vaccines for the rest of the world. So, you know, that's these are the tensions that are there. And that's why I meant, like, in that area, that's one where I think different countries are at different points in terms of progressing their discussions with the world. And similarly, actually, unfortunately, the EU is right this week blocking the inclusion of loss and damage for developing countries, even though we talked so passionately about environmental policies, and they came through incredibly strongly from the citizens. And again, just to add to that point that was made, I think it was a really good point around the reality check that citizens provide. And this is one reason to have those regular assemblies is, you know, the points that the citizens made on environment were a really good, you know, and on farming actually specifically, were a really good reality check for some of what we might hear from big agribusiness. You know, they were really different, and they gave that perspective. So this is kind of what I mean by that. I think it's not just around information campaigns. Lots of the rest of the world has had lots of different experiences with the European Union and with the individual countries of the European Union, historically and currently. And where I actually think we need education is for European, and this is something came out to me from the process. I think European Union citizens need to have education about some of the difficult aspects of the history so that we can be more ambitious for a better, more just, more sustainable global future, and so that we can contribute to that in a really strong way. And that's an internal piece of education that we maybe need in Europe. Thank you.
Indeed. And I think that in itself, it's something that we really need to take and keep in mind as we're going forward. Because like we all discussed, this shouldn't be the end of the process. This is really the beginning of a new kind of democracy, stronger, more inclusive and participatory, that will be able to confront some of those issues and really include different stakeholders in finding solutions for them. And, you know, this conversation today, but there's another one similar to this coming up on the 5th of July. And there will, of course, many other instances where we can all again come together and build on the alliances we created during the conference, but also delve deeper into the issues. And who knows, we might see each other again during a convention in Brussels or anywhere else in Europe. But until then, I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak with us. And it was indeed very interesting to pull together all these different perspectives. It felt a little bit as a microcosm of the plenary discussions we had, but with much more engaging and live conversations, not long speeches. And I appreciate that from all of you. And Dominic, of course, who cannot be with us anymore. But yes, and a big thank you also to all those who tuned in and watch this. Please continue following the European Movement International, either through our website, europeanmovement.eu, or our social media, both on the conference itself, but a whole host of other issues that we are dealing. We're looking forward to working with you and engaging with you throughout Europe. And don't forget to tune in again on the 5th of July for the second discussion on the Conference on the Future of Europe. In the meantime, have a good afternoon, enjoy what's left of the week, and see you very soon.